Welcome. This video interview is one of a series of 7. My name is Chris Heald. Throughout these videos, I will be interviewing John Beckford. During the COVID-19 pandemic in late 2020, John and I wondered why cybernetics and its learning about systems has not played a greater role in the global response to the pandemic. We concluded that cybernetics was not as accessible as it should be. So we decided to conduct these interviews. John is currently president of the Cybernetics Society and has written extensively on the subject. We are both consultant practitioners who use the ideas in our work. We have known one another and collaborated for approximately 20 years. We have never made videos before. Each one lasts about an hour. The series is in a logical order, but they are also designed to be standalone, so you don't need to watch them in sequence if you choose not to. We have had great fun making these videos, and as Stafford Beer might suggest, we hope you will find them more or less useful. Please feel free to contact either of us. So today, as we continue these conversations about cybernetics, we're going to delve into what we're calling the 4 principles. We've touched on them before in some ways, but today that's going to be our absolute focus. And we're going to take them in order. And just so you're aware what's coming, we're going to look at the systems principle, the black box principle, the principle of self-regulation, and the law of requisite variety. Okay, so that's what we're going to cover. And I think John's going to start with the systems principle. So John, to you.
Thanks, Chris. The systems principle is something we tend to think of as being terribly modern, but actually if we explore particularly Eastern philosophy, predating the Greeks, we will find ideas of systemic thought in Buddhism and in the Tao and so on. So in essence, kind of nothing new here. So that's an important thing to say. And it's important to say because in the Western tradition, particularly post the Greek philosophers, we've had a tendency to atomize, to break things down into more and more finite particles in order to take them apart and understand how they work. The system principle argues that any set of entities which are in a relationship acting together will have what are called emergent properties. There will be things that arise from those interactions which don't belong in any of the parts themselves, can't be found in any of the parts. And the example I always use is flight. So if we take an aircraft, take a fuselage and some wings and put them on the end of a runway at Heathrow, it doesn't matter how hard we push, it's not going anywhere. Similarly, if we take a jet engine and we stick it on the end of the runway and set fire to the fuel, it'll generate lots of noise, it might even go bang, but it's not actually going to generate any forward motion. When we put those two things together in a system, an airframe and a propulsion system, and critically with a control system, which might be a pilot or it might be these days an autonomous device, then the interaction of those 3 things gives us this property that we call flight. And you cannot find flight in any of the parts, you can only find it in the whole. So the systems principle says any set of elements interacting may have properties that don't belong in any of the parts. The consequence of that is that when we atomize things, when we take them apart, when we reduce them to their components, we find that the properties we were looking for have disappeared because they don't belong in the components.
Okay, so and your example of the plane adds the controlling principle of the pilot. Do you always have to add something to 2 systems that are kind of interacting to create that emergent effect or property?
Really interesting question. So some systems will have this idea of regulation built into them, so the control will emerge in the interactions anyway. In other systems, there will be a controlling device or element or person or animal. So natural systems, ecosystems evolve without central direction, shall we say. So they emerge into periods of homeostasis, of stability, from the set of interactions that they have without a controlling mind or a controlling force. So the control is embedded in the interaction. In human systems, in engineered systems, then yes, we tend to create a control of some sort. Excuse me.
Okay, so there's a difference there, isn't there? The kind of human organizational systems where there is something that's put in to create that emergent property, and the natural ones that will evolve through their kind of their natural interactions. Okay.
So we will come we'll come later in the conversation. We'll mention this now. There's a thing called the Conant-Ashby theorem, which says every good regulator of the system is constituted by a model of the system. So the regulation, the management, the control of the system that we're describing can only be competently exercised by something which mimics the system itself in terms of its characteristics and behavior. So we'll come to that one a little bit later on. We're first sort of throwing in, there's some proper science hiding behind here.
Oh, wow. So on this systems principle then, because you started by saying it was, very old, there was nothing new in it. And you then quickly went to, here's an example, which actually broke it down to quite, what I'll call quite small systems. So, at what level do we think about this? Because a bit of me thinks, well, surely the whole world or universe could be looked at as a system here. So where does this principle say anything about which level we're talking about when we
At the level of principle, no, and the challenge for somebody addressing a system is to determine what is the system of interest, what is the thing that I think I'm looking at, that I'm describing as a system. So as an observer, we are defining the thing which is of interest to our inquiry, and we are choosing where to put boundaries around it. Now, that's inevitable, that's sort of always a compromise. It's always a matter of making some choices. And for me, it's always a matter of recognizing that the boundaries I've created are porous, that wherever I put the boundary can be a matter of debate and discussion. It's rather more than it is a matter of fact. There's a compromise to that, which is if I'm looking at, for example, a limited company or a formal regulated partnership, I can be looking at something which has a legal boundary, so it has a legal definition of what it is. But I could equally be looking at, an example might be a society, in which case the boundaries are the ones that we choose to place. In terms of scale, we can go from, within your body, there's an endocrine system, there's a lymphatic system, there are various systems operating within the human body, and we can study them as systems with the body as the context. And if we look at the work of James Lovelock, who discovered the hole in the ozone layer, to give you a sort of reference for him, Lovelock describes the whole of the Earth as Gaia, and talks about the Gaia hypothesis, which is about the Earth as a self-regulating, self-organizing system operating in space. So we have scale from one end to the other.
And presumably the smaller and narrower you draw the system, the more you limit the possibility of those emergent properties, because as of your ignorance or through whatever, if you craft it too narrowly, you will miss possibilities, or you might inhibit things that would happen naturally if the system was allowed to function without that narrowing.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting insight. So the challenge is defining what is the system of interest, and we might start with the concept of, let's call it ownership, controlling entity or controlling mind of a particular system would be one way of playing with that. Now, it doesn't mean the boundary is right, but at least it gives us a rational basis for an initial set of choices. But if we start with thinking about what is the emergent properties that it is we're seeking to understand, that actually we can work backwards from the emergent property to understanding where we might put the boundary around the system in order to maintain that phenomenon. So the whole thing then becomes a dialogue, a discussion between the participants in the system, maybe the observers of the system, in terms of negotiating, if you like, what's a meaningful boundary to the discussion. And for me, that there are, certainly if you look at the controlling mind question, there are issues around what can a particular individual or entity actually control, in the sense that it has accountability and responsibility, if you like. And what does it control, and what can it influence? So you can start to sort of, what, if you like, understand measures of distribution of control that says, yeah, these things I can perhaps absolutely control X, but I can only influence Y and Z. So the boundaries start to become, as I say, they're porous, but we have to create something that we define as being the system, and then recognize that there's their externalities. Perhaps most importantly is that discussion about the nature of the boundary, almost more than anything else.
So what I'm taking from that, John, is that, we might, draw boundaries around the system that we're interested in, but we have to be really alert to how restrictive those boundaries can become. And the example I have in my head is a very simplistic one, which is of a business that asks you to look at the way it is struggling to fulfill its orders. And if you look at that business in isolation, you might not have the answer. But if you looked at its supply chain and how it is sourcing its goods, you might start to see why it is failing to deliver. So you might have to go beyond the system and look at the further back in the supply chain for what is causing the failures in performance.
That's absolutely right. And I think if we took that's a really good example. So the supply chain, the other side of that might be environmental factors. So I'm working on something at the moment where the two biggest dominant elements of the system are a set of assets that work together, and their interaction with weather conditions. And actually we have to treat the weather as being a part of the system rather than some externality. So that we can start to measure, we can start to work with the assets in that context. Another good example, and a really rich one, and one I've sort of talked about it in other work, is the healthcare system. And we can apply it to the education system, but healthcare is really good. If we define the boundary of the healthcare system according to its ability to, if you like, produce healthcare services, then we treat the patient as a customer. So when we measure the efficiency and effectiveness of the healthcare system, what we're then measuring is its ability to deliver stuff. And that consequently, all the costs that are borne by the patient are external to the system. All of the impacts of the healthcare system on the patient are not part of the healthcare system. If we treat the patient as being part of the system, so we include them inside the boundary, and we then think about the performance of the whole system, including the patient, we measure efficiency and effectiveness differently. We also measure benefit and cost differently. And we would then think very differently about how we deliver those services, because the patient is part of the system rather than external to it. So that's another quite interesting one, because when you look at the way healthcare is delivered, it has quite a profound impact on the way we think about hospitals and distributed services in particular.
Yeah, no, very interesting. So, I mean, just want to check here. Are we on the systems principle properly here, or have we drifted into other stuff? Because I want to make sure we are not.
We've gone into a bit of detail about how we operationalize the idea of the principle. So it's probably a good idea to shift to the next one.
So just to remind us of the core elements of the systems principle then are that we, effectively, you made a number of points, comes from a long way back, nothing new here. You talked about how two systems, interact to create kind of emergent properties, the natural world doing that without a controlling influence or system, but human organizational ones tending to need that. And then we talked about, where you might draw the boundaries in the system and being alert to the importance of their porous nature. Is that effectively what the systems principle is about there?
Yeah, that's good coverage. That's good coverage.
Okay, so the next one on this list, which absolutely intrigues me, is the black box principle. Oh, it's a deep sigh. So what's this about then?
The black box principle stems from the idea that to some extent all things are not completely knowable. So there are some things about organization, there are some things about interaction, there are some things about a system that are unknowable to the observer. And again, back to the atomization, the reductionist approach to science throughout recent history has been this fragmentation, this breaking down of things. The black box principle recognizes that the systems principle applies and says, actually, rather than attempting to fully understand the detail of something, can we treat it as a black box? In other words, can we play with its inputs, observe the effect on the outputs, and determine the functioning of the system, not by interrogating it in depth, but understanding its behavior as an observer, so that rather than getting deeply into the minutiae of it, we can say, if we change these inputs, we get these effects on the output, therefore the box is doing this. And we do it all the time. We're doing it this morning. I'm talking into a black box in my office, and you're talking into another black box in your office, and we both have some idea how the technology is doing what it does, but it's only sort of some idea. But we know that if I make noises and wave my arms around, then the system will record an image and it'll record a sound and it'll replay it faithfully at your end. Neither of us really needs to understand the detail of that in order to make it work. So when we start to think about ultra large systems and complex systems, even what Stafford Beer described as exceedingly complex systems, the argument is we can't understand them in full detail. So are we better to stand back from them and observe them? It has two benefits. One is it can be incredibly quick, because it's a very, very fast way of interrogating behavior. Two is it forces us to stand at a particular distance from the problem. So we use it as a means of not intervening too deeply in a problem sometimes, but actually stepping back from it and maintaining the autonomy of the system and being able to say, well, actually, if what we want is more green, then at this end we'll put more green powder into the flow, but we won't get involved in the detail of the dynamical flow of fluid in a system. Because we don't have the mathematics to model that particularly well yet. B, we don't really understand the chemistry perhaps well enough, so let's just throw some more in, see what happens. And of course, in our adaptive world, in the system of cybernetics that we're describing, we're using the output of information, the modified output, to understand the behavior, to further then modify the inputs. So we can start to experiment with the system, learn about its behavior and modify its behavior, and of course, modify our own behavior at the same time based on the observation of outputs.
So I kind of get the kind of sort of practical nature of that. You look at you look at how something reacts to you. How the inputs you do, how you prod it or poke it, or what you do with it, and you see what the effect of that is. So I kind of get that you don't have to understand the internal workings to be able to see the behaviors and try different things with it and see what the response is. So the bit that then I'm struggling with a bit more. So I kind of get, I have personal ignorance about how technology and communication works, but actually it's not unknowable, is it? There are people who do know about it. So presumably there's a difference here, is that between things that, you know, are understood by kind of humankind, even if I personally am ignorant about them. I won't say you're ignorant about them, but I will own up to that. But there's things that we are understood by people. So in that sense, you know, it's not unknowable, is it? You
No,
know,
this isn't. So,
then,
with the technology, with any sort of manufactured artifact, there's a level at which we must know it in order to be able to create it and recreate it and reproduce it faithfully. When we come to more organic systems, it becomes harder, and that might apply at a number of levels. And the first level at which it applies is we don't really know how the brain works. As we understand it in principle, we understand the notion of sort of communicating with the brain, but we don't understand its structure properly. We don't understand how it interacts and performs. So there's an element of unknowableness about it, and if we take it apart, then we can be pretty sure the one thing that's going to happen is it's not going to work. So we have to deal with the brain at this point as a black box. We can look at a conversation between two brains, two people communicating, two or more people communicating, and the box becomes opaque rather than black, because what we're then studying is the conversation between two people, and we can understand some parts of it are inherently knowable, some parts of it are less knowable or maybe unknowable, because whilst I can monitor and react to your responses, what I can't do is understand maybe your motivations unless you choose to articulate them. So I can impute motivations to you, but I can't know them, and you maybe can't know. I mean, you're a football fan, so when you watch somebody playing football and some striker leaps up in the air and either with his head or his foot catches a ball on the fly and boots it into the back of a net, and everybody says what a splendid player he is, and I might argue, well, yes, he's splendid, but mainly he's lucky, and he's had quite a lot of practice at doing that. How did he do it is a really interesting question. And then you can imagine the set of calculations that might be required to think about the trajectory and pace of the ball, and trajectory and pace of the player, and the trajectory and pace of all the other players, and the set of interactions that go on in order for that particular player to leap in the air and catch the ball in just the right manner to beat everything. Or you can kind of go, it's a bit of a black box, that, isn't it? We can't really understand everything that went on there within the limits of the languages that we normally use to describe such things.
No, I can see that, and the example that mostly comes into my head here, and it's a slightly scary one, is the whole thing about the climate crisis in which we find ourselves, because I think that industrially we've treated that as a black box. We've been bothered about some of the outputs that we might get from it, like heat and stuff, but we haven't thought about the other outputs we might be causing that actually are having quite a major impact on the sort of core system that is definitely unknown. I mean, I think we are unpeeling it a bit, but we just don't know how parts of the natural world interact with one another. And, we were talking about trees the other day, how they all, we just don't know that. So actually the black box I get as a principle, but you have to look at all of the inputs and all of the outputs, don't you, in your analysis of it, really? You have to be very alert to that, I would imagine.
Yes, and that, and this again takes us back to that boundary question. Is if I've defined something as being a black box, then I've necessarily put a boundary around it, and then anybody else coming along will look at it and say, why have you put the boundary there? Why have you treated this as an externality? So the economists talk about endogenous and exogenous impact. Why we put the boundary where we put the boundary is a really critical conversation. And whether it's putting the boundary around an individual and saying Fred's a bad boy, or putting a boundary around a whole organization and saying the way this organization is structured creates Fred as a bad boy, it becomes a really interesting conversation, because what we're trying to tease apart is how does this whole thing work without actually being able to interrogate large parts of it in any meaningful way at a detailed level.
No, I get that, and I mean, I've obviously focused on a particular point here, but I can see that you can get the black box to give you the outputs you might want, but you also have to be alert to the unintended consequences that you're creating as a result of it.
Yeah,
So
we've talked about regulators, and we're going to talk about more about self-regulation shortly, I'm sure. But there is this idea of an ethical regulator, and I've sort of touched on the idea in other work. When we talk about the leadership of organisation, when we talk about the management of an organisation, one of the things we're talking about is the ethical and value set that informs decision making, particularly in human systems. So when we start to play with that, we're looking also at how do we regulate behaviour, and how do we define good ethics, how do we define morality, and that then also informs how we think about the structure of the system. So we can get quite easily beyond this black box as artifact to black box as system, and understanding the system from a number of different dimensions, which might be about traditional forms of measurement, but might also be about morality and ethics.
yeah, okay. So black box principle. I mean, what I'm taking from this, and you're going to correct me if I get this wrong, is that it's a pragmatic way of making sure we pay attention to the things that are unknowable by us. So our observations have to be about the inputs and outputs. We have to be comprehensive about how we do that to avoid, having an unintended impact on the workings of the black box, which we don't understand. But in our cybernetics, to acknowledge and work with black boxes can sometimes be helpful, because if we won't proceed before we know everything about everything, well, we'll never do anything. Is a bit of what flows from that, I think.
Accepting our necessary level of ignorance is quite a big step in truth. I remember talking to a company a few years ago about how they ran their budgeting process, and it was massive. It was an enormous budgeting process, but actually at one level it was very simple. And so that the idea of the black box allowed a description of that process in very simple and quite elegant terms that broke through the complexity that they created for themselves, which wasn't a necessary part of the system. It was just because they all understood it in a particular way, and breaking them away and saying, step back here and look at it. Think of it as a black box. This is what you're trying to achieve. This is what you're putting into it. And by redefining a boundary, you're able to go, but actually this bit of the system over here tells you more about what's going on in the black box than any amount of interrogating the black box will tell you, because actually this is the thing that's influencing how it behaves. So by being able to step back and treat it that way, which was challenging for people who love detail, that's really challenging, because I think the closer they get, the more they can see, where in truth, the closer they get, the less they can see, because they stop looking at the system and they're only then looking at the parts.
Okay, so actually it's an interesting principle, because it's a principle of how we might draw or analyze or diagnose the workings of a system, but it's also a helpful principle when we're trying to get people to think about what they're doing and stop them being trapped in their own details around it, which, I relate very much to that, where different people will have different levels of detailed understanding, and that becomes the conversation rather than, okay, so what are we trying to achieve here overall, and what do we have to put in to get those outputs? Okay.
Absolutely. So we all, many of us drive motor cars or ride bicycles or whatever. Back to the technology question, we might understand in principle how those things work. In detail, haven't got a clue. But we can all sit in them and operate them. We can learn to operate the machine by manipulating the inputs in order to achieve the outputs we want, without particularly understanding any of the technologies that make it possible. So actually we rely on black boxes massively in our day-to-day lives. Otherwise we'd have to deal with an overwhelming level of complexity in every decision we make. Whereas we know we can open the car by pushing button 1 and we can start the car by pushing button 2. We move lever 3, we can make it go forwards, and we move lever 3 into a different position, we can make it go backwards. How that happens needn't concern us particularly, because we can get the output we want, the outcome we want, without having to worry about that level. So it's massively economical in terms of our ability to interrogate a situation as well, which is, in a fast-moving, complex world, is really useful.
So an important principle of black boxes in a discipline, cybernetics, where we're looking at such big things, and there will be elements that are unknowable, or areas that it's actually not appropriate or necessary to explore in depth for that to address a particular question.
Okay.
So should we move on?
Yes, because
self-regulation is the third principle,
and it takes us very nicely there.
Okay.
Why? Because if we're going to treat something as a black box, then everything that happens inside the black box happens on its own without us intervening in its management. So in order for a black box to be effective, there must be something inside it which is creating a regulatory or a controlling process within the black box. We don't necessarily know what it is, but we know it's there. So actually the principle of self-regulation says that any dynamical system will self-organize, it will self-regulate, as long as we maintain the energy that goes into it, based on its internal and external information exchanges. So internally, it will be using information to do the things that it does, whatever they happen to be, and it will act to seek a point of stability, a point of homeostasis. The external influences on it will tend to push it away from that position of homeostasis, that position of balance, and it will adapt itself internally to enable that to happen. So it will balance itself despite those forces. Self-regulation is important again because it's very economical, because it's built into the system. It doesn't require an overhead in terms of, let's call it managerial content, managerial direction, in order to be exercised. So the system is designed, created so that it has a particular output. Its management of that output is embedded in the control system that regulates it, so it keeps itself in balance without us having to externally interfere. We can scale that up and say that's a really powerful thing to do, and we can watch it happen. Your blood pressure regulates itself in your body without you consciously having to intervene in it. So it's set up as a system of checks and balances. I believe there are 35 of them, but I've never counted, that maintain your blood pressure within a given range without you actively having to do anything. It is just inherent in the design of the system, and that's brilliant. You're sitting there, I can see you're still breathing, it's an autonomous activity, it just happens. Air flows in, air flows out, without you having to consciously do it. You're sitting upright without having to particularly consciously think about it. Your eyes are absorbing light and receiving messages. And you're actively involved in none of that in terms of making it happen, except when you go, I'm really going to stare at this thing over here, or I know I'm going to walk up a hill, therefore I'll take a deep breath before I start, because I'm going to be underwater for the next 30 seconds, so I need lots of air So we have a whole bunch of autonomic systems operating in our bodies, which between them, give us, pure blood. They process food into energy. They give us sweat, and they give us things that we excrete and all that sort of, without us having to be consciously involved in it. And that's brilliant. I mean, it's a real marvel of nature that happens. When we look at organizations, we can think about the same things happening. We can design the organization so that it self-regulates, that we can use mechanisms within our control processes, within our operating processes, that damp error, if you like, that regulate the process without us having to do so manually. And in so doing, we make them much more efficient to manage. And in human terms, we can generate much greater autonomy within such organizations than if we attempt to regulate everything from the center. So the idea of self-regulation is we design a process so that it sustains its own position of equilibrium. And in doing so, we relieve ourselves of the need to manage it on a direct basis, because it becomes self-managing. Doing so creates the opportunity for us to do more interesting stuff. So all the good stuff that we do with our brains, which is about creativity and music and poetry and all that good stuff, is because we don't have to waste our time and energy, stabilizing our bodies, because that's all done for us.
So on the organizational one then, so when I mean, does that become AI, artificial intelligence, when effectively you're the self-regulation is improving that system? It's kind of
a bit more complicated than that. And no, it's not AI. It's real. It's excuse me. It's real eye. It's human eye. It's human intelligence. I mean, it is built into our bodies and the bodies of all.
No, I don't mean in the body one. When you go to an organizer, because you gave the human system example, and then you jumped onto organizational. Maybe my head was getting too far ahead too quickly there, because I went to technology and I kind of thought, okay, so if you start to think about technology, because actually it's stability, it's not status quo that you're looking for in a self-regulation, is it? So it might be that to continue to do its job and fulfill its purpose, it has to evolve and improve some of that stuff.
So there's two levels to that. Number one is homeostasis, and homeostasis acts to keep things the same.
So that is the same. So that is
blood pressure, for example, is a good example. It acts to keep the blood pressure in the human body within a set of parameters that it finds acceptable, that are just sort of natural parameters. Allostasis is the next stage along. Allostasis is about dynamic stability, so that we're interested in then systems that restabilize and adapt over time. So riding a bicycle is a good example. So a bicycle remains upright with a rider on it, provided you keep putting energy into propelling it forward. If you try to stabilize it as a static system, it'll probably fall over after a reasonably short period of time. So its stability rests in its dynamism. There's a difference between being static and being stable, if you like, and stable is a dynamic context.
So I might be missing the point here, though, because blood pressure, so it doesn't stay the same. So it sort of almost acts as a warning system. So if I do something that's overly, threatening to my overall system, my blood pressure will go up or down, and actually, then it alerts me or those observing me that they have to do something about it. So it doesn't hold it at one level. In a way, it does adapt to cause, me to kind of know, I need to stop this running lark or whatever,
So we're back to boundaries. So ultimately, if you increase your blood pressure sufficiently, something will go bang somewhere in your body, and it will stop doing what it's meant to do. And yes, we get warning signs on that. We get breathless, we get florid, we get heart palpitations, whatever. We get a whole bunch of warning signals, and the brain uses them then to go beyond that autonomous state and say some other action needs now to happen in order to damp the variation that we're seeing in system X. And whether that's fluid retention, whether it's high blood pressure, whatever, there are if you like managerial actions, governance actions that happen. But the fact is, your blood pressure still regulates itself within that particular set of boundaries at its own level. But there are, back to where we were before, there are multiple other systems also interacting with your blood pressure, some of which cause it to go up, and some of which might cause it to go down. And so there's the combination of physical activity, then there's your the level of sugar and the level of nutrients in your system, etc. all impact on that. The health of your heart as a pump has an impact on that as well. The sponginess is that the right word? Elasticity of your veins and arteries and the walls all combine to affect the blood pressure. What you can't do is say, instead of having, I don't know, 120/80, I'm going to operate at 240/160, because you're going to be dead. Your body can't operate at a much higher blood pressure and still be your body under conventional thinking. When we come to this sort of this notion of self-regulation, is really interesting. We can design manufactured systems to operate within a given set of parameters. So we can set a capacity, we can set a throughput, we can create a set of expectations in designing a system so that it says, we will produce X number of widgets an hour on this machine, and so the input materials rate is this, the energy consumption will be that, the amount of labor required will be another number, the cost will be, and we can set that up and we can manage it and we can allow it to run, and we can make it self-regulate. We can make it alert us or adapt itself locally to changes in the conditions. So if we can say, if the raw materials stop arriving, stop operating, for example. If the energy level is too low, if there's not enough electricity coming in, you might slow it down or you might stop it, because depending whether or not it's critical. So you can design a system to behave in that self-regulating manner. The Japanese quality philosophy, there's quite a lot about operating systems that stop if they believe they're producing defective parts. So rather than making defective parts, it just stops the system, allows the human operator to come along and fix whatever the problem is, and then it can carry on again. So we use this idea quite a lot. Within that system, though, what we are, when something is self-regulating, it's either got natural limits imposed on it that it has evolved for itself, or it's got human limits on it that we have imposed on it. So we said it can self-regulate within these boundaries. So we've set the capacity and the limits. So organizationally, we need a higher order device that looks at that and says, are those limits still appropriate? We've set those limits. So should we still be producing motor cars that use internal combustion engines that generate emissions that damage the environment? The operating level that self-regulates can just continue making cars or continue making widgets for cars. It can't decide not to. So its autonomy is limited to the ability to do what it's been designed to do. So it's autonomic in that respect. The higher order system is the thing that then says, is doing this still the right thing to do? So we're then starting to impose different layers of regulation on that, informed by different questions.
Yeah, and that could become your automated system in future, couldn't you? So you could build into your production line, the ability to make orders for supplies because the system recognizes that you're short of stuff, or to, tell your customer when their car's going to arrive on their driveway, or what, you can extend it. That would be,
yes, and there is a lot of that. I mean, you talked about AI. To some extent, building the parameters into the system gives it a degree of a limited degree of something that we might call artificial intelligence, because we've given it decision criteria that we've embedded in it. If you look at hotels are a good example. Airlines are a good example. They run yield management systems. So the idea is to maintain your hotel occupancy or maintain the level of occupancy of your aircraft or your train. So their sales systems, particularly your website-driven things, are set up to work with pricing management that are designed precisely to do what you've just said. We've got low bookings that night. We'll offer a discount. And you can actually build that into the system so that it's triggered by, if you've only got sort of 30% bookings, drop your rates per night and advertise it as an automated process. So you are building some of the human decision making into that system and allowing it to self-regulate. But it's important to note that the decision to do that is the human decision. The system isn't thinking to itself, I haven't got enough occupancy, I'll sell
I'll take some more.
Yeah, it's thinking to itself. So 30% occupancy level triggers a decision that we've already made, which is, if at this level, do this. So we've made that decision and embedded it.
And even more fundamentally, that it's not making the decision that says, at the moment, you're not letting me influence this and I want to change the system to do it, doesn't allow you to do that. So
No.
so this self-regulation stuff, I think the examples you gave of the human body and the kind of natural world, very clear, helpful. And actually I jumped us into organizations a bit too quickly, but we've now come back and I think we kind of get self-regulation is effectively the maintaining the stability within the system by kind of self-regulating itself. That's the fundamental principle that's there, isn't it?
But it is important to think it's a dynamic stability, not a static stability.
Okay. Yeah.
So our complex system has to be an adaptive complex system. So it's using information about itself to continue to manage itself towards a given end, a given purpose. The managerial interventions in that might change the end, might change the purpose or the focus of activity. They might change the operation of the activity. They might change the parameters within which the activity operates. So we need to understand managerial intervention in a very different way when we think about this, which is as much about if you like, the decisions the system can make and how we might embed them into the processes as it is about leadership or behavior or administration.
But it's self-regulating to achieve the purpose that it was designed to do or exist to do.
And so there's this thing that we can build a system to be autonomic, to be self-managing up to a point. The limitation of that autonomic system is that it can only do the things we designed it to do in the first place. There are no choices embedded in it about doing something differently. And if you want to link that into management speak, the autonomic system would be the sort of stuff that Frederick Taylor was talking about in the early 1900s, the notion of scientific management that Henry Ford embedded in the moving production line for the Ford Model T, and so on. That's so where those ideas have been, in many respects, learned.
And so I think we better move on to number 4, had we?
We had.
Which, interestingly, I think you describe as the law of requisite variety. So, law sounds stronger than principle to me.
Law is not my word, law is Ross Ashby's word. He talked about the law of requisite variety. I will read it out because I think it's important I get it right. Regulation of any system can only be competent when the regulator has as much capacity to generate variety, the number of states or conditions that it can exhibit, as the system to be regulated. What on earth does that mean? At a very, very simple level, we'll take a light bulb, or a lighting system. A light bulb has 2 conditions. One is on, the other is off. So its variety, if you like, is 2. It can be in either of those 2 conditions. To be able to competently operate the light, we need a regulating mechanism, a switch, capable of dealing with on or off. And so we've got a balance between the conditions of the light and the conditions of the control system. So in effect, the light switch is a model of the light. When we step back and think about that, we go, but what if the bulb's broken? And so we've now got a third state of the light, which is we operate the switch, the light doesn't come on. So we've got a choice that says, the switch might not be working, or the bulb might not be working, or there might be no electricity in the system. So the exhibiting conditions remain at 2, on or off, but the number of ways in which it can be on or off starts to increase. So if we want to be able to regulate light effectively, we have to have a management system which is capable of diagnosing then the reason the light isn't working. So that has to be able to deal with the no power, switch not working, cable broken, bulb failure. It has to be able to deal with all those different states that the system can exhibit if it's going to be competent in regulating light. So the law of requisite variety very, very simply says, if this thing can have 5 conditions, then the thing that regulates it has to have 5 conditions in order to be able to do so. Now, When you bring managerialism into that, you can limit it and say, well, I kind of don't care, it's either on or it's off, so I will only deal with managing the two conditions. And that's typically how, in a pejorative sense, bureaucracy works. Somebody inside a big organization decides that we will only sell tickets between 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock in the morning, and in effect forces everybody who wants to be a customer to respond to that, or not buy a ticket. So the customers, on the other hand, might want to shop 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but actually the system says you can only do from 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. So the system has limited the variety that the customers can engage with. So it's ineffective. It's not going to work for the customers. So this is all about how do we understand and balance that equation. And of course, the more elements there are in the system, the more difficult it becomes to sustain that notion of requisite variety. So Ashby came up with what he called the ultra-stable homeostat. And that was a mechanism for saying, within the limits of the system as we defined it, this is the variety equation, but actually we build a higher order homeostat on top of that homeostat in order to understand when it's being ineffective.
So I understand the light bulb. So I can imagine that it might be dangerous to ask a question about a whole factory or a whole system, because it could get very complicated. But why is it important? Why is this principle important? You know,
because we're managerially incompetent for the most part. So when we look at the complexity that can emerge in for example, the nature of a factory, and we then look at the managerial capability we apply to that, whether that's in terms of the automation of systems or the higher order managerial capability of making strategic decisions. If we don't understand and respect the number of different states that the factory itself can generate, then we're always going to fail to manage it effectively. So for example, and it is a good example, somebody comes along, what were we looking at a few years ago? Looking at a paper mill a few years ago, and the presenting question was, why aren't we making money? And the very simple answer was that the cost of producing the paper was outweighing the revenue generated from selling the paper. That was why they weren't making money. When we started to then dig into the black box in a little more detail, the people making paper defined everything in terms of a production problem related to the number of tons of paper per day that they would produce. The people who were selling the paper were characterizing everything in terms of the number of customers that they might satisfy and retain by lowering prices. But the two ends of the equation weren't joined together. So we're generating variety at both ends in terms of the numbers and types of product, allowing that to proliferate without understanding the economic consequences that were in the middle. Because I defined my end as a production problem, you defined your end as a sales problem, and nobody had joined together and said it's a business problem. So the variety generation of the factory was massive. The ability of the management to damp that variety, to absorb that variety, was limited by their perspectives that said, one said it's a production problem, the other said it's a sales problem. So it was then addressed with limited tool sets, neither of which addressed the actual problem that was being experienced. Does that help?
Yeah, it does help. But it's an organizational example where you talk about the kind of management involvement. So does the same principle apply if we think about something more natural, a natural system? Or is it an organizational cybernetic principle that we're dealing with here?
It applies in nature. Again, we're back to this idea of back to the blood pressure problem. The system has evolved to operate within certain parameters to exhibit a number of states. When it goes beyond that set of states, there will be an institutional response, a physical response to going beyond that. One physical response
And that's
might be,
effectively your management intervention.
yes, so it might be death. Death might be the consequence of pushing blood pressure beyond a particular point, because there's the experience of stroke and catastrophic consequences that arise therefrom.
But it
So
could be
the managerial response is to kill the system. So it works. It works just the same. The body has limited range of physiological responses to the conditions it experiences. So if you get blood poisoning, the body attempts to kill off that blood poisoning, so it reacts. But actually, the act of reacting can be enough to cause major organs to shut down and kill people. We intervene in that differently with medicine. So what we're doing in applying medicine to an illness is amplifying the variety of the body in terms of its ability to respond to the threat. So the coronavirus example at the moment, what are we doing? We're vaccinating people. So the body has an immune response to COVID infection, which causes respiratory problems, which causes high temperature, etc., breathing problems, and so on. The body's ability to respond to that virus is limited. We can treat it, we can ameliorate it, but ultimately we haven't been able to cure it. It cures itself. And we've done that by damping the responses of the body so we stop inflammation running out of control, in essence. What the vaccine does is it amplifies the ability of the body to respond to the COVID infection. And it does that by, in effect, alerting the body and says, here's a little bit of a bad thing, generate some antibodies that will deal with that bad thing if it comes along. So the body is now primed, we've amplified its ability to respond to the COVID threat. And in doing so, we reduce the number of people that get seriously ill, we reduce the number of people that die, and most interestingly, we reduce the ability of the thing to be transmitted to other people. And that's probably the biggest win of the three, in a sense, because it stops the thing traveling. So what we've done is we've, with treatment, we damp the impact of the variety generated by the illness. So we can give it drugs and all the rest of which slow it down. By giving a vaccine, we amplify the ability of the body to respond to the threat when it arrives. So variety management is about doing those things. It's about damping undesired response and amplifying managerial capability to respond to those two things. So we do it in organizations, we do it through structural devices. So we have a hierarchy which delegates control, which allows self-regulation. We have sets of ways of behaving, we have processes, we have information systems, and these are all devices for both damping variation within the organization and amplifying managerial capability to control that variation through the flow of information.
So does this law then ultimately take us to a place that all systems, will end or die or finish? Because, whether it takes minutes, years, or billions of years, actually at some point there will be a failure that needs a management intervention, and at some level of the planet or whatever, that management intervention is way beyond our comprehension. Is that what that means? Because if you don't have more responses than features like on and off, then ultimately that you're gonna get to that place. Is that right? Is that what?
Yes, I mean, ultimately, if the sun switches off or goes out, we're all dead. If for some reason the universe decides that gravity no longer applies, we're all dead. If the Earth stops spinning, we're all dead. So there's a sort of if we don't have sufficient managerial capacity to maintain things within let's call it an envelope of performance, then it's going to fail. And we're getting better at this. We've started, if you go back even a generation, all of our management was concerned with bottom line. And in the 90s, we got to a triple bottom line. We started to think about environmental and social, as well as profit. We've now got more sophisticated conversations going on about the notion of sustainable development. I think the question is whether or not we're moving fast enough in that direction to deal with the variety that's being generated by the things that we're doing. And certainly there's a strong argument at the moment that says we're not moving fast enough, particularly in relation to emissions.